Good evening. It's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Anna Gibson Holloway. Dr. Holloway is the Fleet History Team Lead within the Histories branch of the Naval History and Heritage Command in Washington, D.C. There, she is responsible for the team that produces the Dictionary of American Naval Fighting Ships, as well as other projects dealing with sailor stories, fleet history, and fleet support. Prior to joining the Naval History and Heritage Command in 2020, she was Museum Services Director of Search Incorporated, a global archaeological and cultural resources management firm. From 2014 to 2017, she served as the maritime historian for the National Park Service, also in Washington, D.C., where she provided expertise relating to American maritime history. From 2000 to 2014, Anna served in a number of roles at the Mariners Museum in Newport News, Virginia, culminating as the Vice President of Museum Collections and Programs. As curator of the award-winning USS Monitor Center, she led a multidisciplinary team in the creation of the 20,000 square foot award-winning exhibition and assisted in the development of the center's state-of-the-art conservation facility. She has lectured internationally on a variety of maritime topics, published articles in naval history, Civil War Times, and American Heritage, among others. She's curated numerous exhibitions and programs, appeared on national television, most recently in National Geographic's Drain the Oceans, and is the co-author, along with Jonathan White, of Our Little Monitor, published in 2018. The Winston-Salem native graduated from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro with baccalaureate degrees in English literature and classical medieval civilization. She received her master's degree in early modern history and her PhD in American history from the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia. Dr. Holloway, thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me here. I've been looking forward to this for quite some time now. And well, today is the perfect day for this presentation, being the 159th anniversary of the first time CSS Virginia got blown up. There's going to be several more times over the course of this particular presentation that she'll get blown up again and again. But can we have the next slide, please? Just as John pointed out, I am currently with the Naval History and Heritage Command, but the work that I'm going to present here tonight really comes out of the years that I worked at the Mariners Museum, putting together USS Monitor Center with an incredible team. It's time that we look at the other ship involved in the Battle of Hampton Roads, and I hope you're going to have some fun with what we'll be talking about tonight. Now, while the Battle of Hampton Roads between Monitor and Virginia was important, another lesser-known battle is what I'm going to be focusing on for part of this presentation, and that's the battle with the water, the battle to salvage the vessels that were the victims of war and were obstructions to both war and peace. Next slide, please. Now, I will focus much of my presentation today on USS Merrimac and her later incarnation of CSS Virginia. But a quick note on the name Merrimac. Old habits died hard, and the overwhelming favorite name for the ironclad ship throughout the 19th century was Merrimac, no matter what side you were on. So because of the sources, you'll find me tonight actually using both names interchangeably throughout. But yes, the ironclad, Virginia, was her name. In Virginia, of Virginia iron and wood, and by Virginians was she built. And in Virginia's waters, now made classic by her exploits, she made a record which shall live forever. These are the words of Confederate Colonel Charles Norris writing in the 19th century. And of course, judging by how many decades it took to substantially salvage her post-war, it probably felt that she would lie in her watery grave forever as well. Next slide, please. Now, to set the stage for her first demise, let's look at the state of the U.S. Navy in early 1861. At that time, the U.S. Navy had 90 ships, but only 52 were considered serviceable. Of those, only 4 were in northern waters where they could be easily deployed against the rebellion. 4 vessels were in Pensacola, 1 was in the Great Lakes, and 24 were spread out around the world in the Mediterranean, the Pacific, off the coast of Africa, in Brazil, in the Caribbean. The rest were laid up in ordinary, which basically meant they were undergoing repairs of some sort or were simply mothballed. The Merrimac was one of those. She was in ordinary at Gosport Navy Yard in Hampton Roads. She was a relatively young vessel at this point, having been commissioned in February of 1856. She spent her early time in the Caribbean and Europe before needing her first repairs in 1857. She had notoriously difficult, as they called it then, deranged engines. She then spent time as flagship in the Pacific Squadron, but her engines, always unreliable, landed her in Norfolk at Gosport Navy Yard in February of 1860, and she was still there in April of 1861. Now, as you all know, at that time, Virginians were split both politically and ideologically over the idea of secession. But when President Lincoln called for volunteers to fight their Southern brethren, many in Virginia felt they had to take a stand. And so on April 17, 1861, Virginia legislature voted for secession. Now, this had been anticipated by Gideon Welles, who was Secretary of the U.S. Navy, and he had plans already underway to remove valuable ships and war material from Gosport Navy Yard in Portsmouth, Virginia. But mixed messaging that was reaching the Commandant, Charles Stewart Macaulay, resulted in very little ship, war material, anything being removed by the time that Virginia Governor John Letcher ordered Major General William Booth Tolliver of the Virginia Militia to Norfolk to occupy the Navy Yard. Now, citizens in Norfolk and Portsmouth quickly went to work, and they began placing disruptions to navigation off of Sewell's Point so that it would be hard to get either in or out of the Gosport Navy Yard where the U.S. Navy was still ensconced. Other citizens decided to create a ruse to make the Commandant Macaulay believe that huge numbers of troops were arriving by train, running the same train back and forth with the same men on board. They would arrive noisily to great fanfare and then sneak off and then arrive again, making Macaulay think that vast numbers of armed men were massing outside of the yard. The work had been at a fevered pitch on trying to get the Merrimac ready, because for Gideon Welles, it was so important to get the Merrimac out and up to Philadelphia. Even though she was nearly ready, Macaulay panicked and ordered the abandonment of Gosport Navy Yard by U.S. Navy personnel, which culminated in the burning of the yard, as you see here, and the ships there on April 20th. Only the sloop of war Cumberland was successfully removed by U.S. Navy personnel that night, though she was hampered by those very obstructions placed by the Virginians, with Cumberland actually briefly dragging one of the sunken wrecks as she made her successful escape. Now, while Union forces attempted thorough destruction, they left much of the yard damaged but still usable for the Virginia State Navy. So both the Union and Confederacy at this point had contributed to the chaos left behind in the Elizabeth River. The ruins of Germantown, Plymouth, Pennsylvania, Raritan, Columbia, Delaware, Dauphin, the United States, and Merrimac were obstructions to navigation, to be sure, but they also were, or they contained, valuable war material. Now, the immediate problem for the Virginians was to solve how to raise them, and not just the large vessels, but also the smaller obstructions to navigation, and who was going to do it. Next slide, please. All right, Joseph Pierce, not actually pictured here, but he was a diver at the Navy Yard. He was formerly the master ship's carpenter at the yard, and he had resigned his commission to remain with the Virginia Navy. And he used whatever means he had available at the yard to begin the work. So he had diving bells, he had some surface-supplied pumps for diving suits, as you see here. And he did get the United States pumped out and began raising guns and shot and some gunpowder from some of the sunken vessels. But it was clear that it was going to take a larger effort overall. Now, fortunately for Pierce, as well as the nascent Virginia State Navy, a local firm had the resources and expertise to raise all of the vessels and ordnance in the yard. That firm was B&J Baker and Company, then located at Baker's Wharf in Portsmouth, Virginia, right next to the Navy Yard. Now, books about the early days of the war occasionally mention this firm, though just as often the firm remains nameless. Most modern books on CSS Virginia or the Battle of Hampton Roads give the Bakers a sentence, if anything at all, in part because primary sources are really so devoid of description. But there is one 19th century volume by John W.H. Porter, his record of events in Norfolk County, that's a little more descriptive. He says, quote, "The sunken vessels Merrimac, Plymouth, Germantown, Dolphin, which were lying alongside the wharves of the Navy Yard, were gotten up by the Baker Wrecking Company under direction of the Confederate authorities to get them out of the way." He mentions that these authorities thought that some of the vessels were salvageable and that thus some work was commenced on the last three with a view to fitting them out. The Merrimac, he says, was burned down to her waterline, and it was not thought any use could be made of her beyond taking her machinery out of her. But subsequent events proved the fallacy of human predictions, for the stone which the builders rejected became the keystone of the temple. The Bakers would be the ones who delivered the keystones to the Confederate Navy. Next slide, please. So who were these skillful artisans that were touted in Confederate-leaning papers as the celebrated wreckers, the Bakers, who expeditiously and faithfully raised the ships at Gosport? Well, these were the Baker brothers, Joseph and Barnabas. On the left is an image of Joseph Baker. There are no extant images of his older brother Barnabas, but the young man next to them there, Ebenezer Morgan Stoddard, was one of their stalwart workmen, both before the war and after. So the Bakers were the first professional wrecking firm to open a salvage business in the Chesapeake Bay region. They moved there in the 1840s to work in the lucrative guano trade. And so they were there to salvage the vessels for insurance firms. For a time, they were the only professional wrecking business south of New York and north of the Florida Keys. The Bakers and their associates were instrumental in helping the Confederacy transform the destruction of Gosport Navy Yard into a growing naval threat to the Union. And so the assumption of most people would be that either they tacitly or overtly were loyal Confederates, and that there are a lot of compelling reasons to think that. I mean, they raised the Merrimac. And in the days following the secession of Virginia and the burning of Gosport, many within the Union considered all citizens of Norfolk, Virginia and its environs to be suspect. And the Bakers and their associates were no exception. But deeper analysis shows that the Bakers were by no means Confederate sympathizers. In fact, the Bakers and most of their closest associates were all from New England and were staunchly pro-Union. Of the raising of the ships at Gosport, it was known locally that these Cape Codmen were forced to accept the work and perform it, using for it their wrecking apparatus. They were unable to leave Hampton Roads because of their value to the Confederacy, so they found themselves faced with some very difficult choices. Situated as they were next to the Navy Yard, as well as in possession of the means to raise everything there, they were quickly pressed into service by the Virginia State Navy. But the Virginia State Navy made it worth their while. French Forrest, now in command of the yard, issued a contract to the Bakers for raising the vessels. Though not sympathetic, had the Bakers not signed this contract, they would have likely found that all doors in town were shut to them, including access to basics like food and life-sustaining supplies. Others who had refused found themselves starving. The Bakers would receive $5,000 to raise the two sloops of war, the Germantown and Plymouth. The Merrimac, though, was considerably larger and commanded a larger price. The contract for raising her hulk, dated May 18, 1861, guaranteed the Bakers $10,000 for a successful lift. That was done on May 30th, 1861. Richmond newspapers triumphantly reported the following. He said, "Yesterday morning at 5 o'clock, 4 steam pumps were put in motion, the holes battened and leaks having been previously stopped, and indeed every preparation made preparatory to the operation of pumping. The 4 pumps discharged 160 barrels of water each minute, or 40 barrels each. And at 6 o'clock yesterday afternoon, I went on board the raised steamer. She was alongside the wharf at the Navy Yard. They had then, as Baker told me, discharged 12.5 feet of water. They're almost 6 feet in the hold. She was up 9 or 10 feet out of the surface of the water, and her water pipes had been cut, and the magazine cock was found turned so as to let in the stream of water. Thus, Baker turned so as to shut off the influx. The damage to the engine is not of serious character. I learned that it is not improbable that Merrimac may be taken into the dry dock today." Well, It wasn't improbable. French force reported to Robert E. Lee that same day, "We have the Merrimac up and just pulling her in the dry dock." Now, the occasion was momentous for the Confederacy. Raising the Merrimac, as well as other vessels of Gosport, was not an unusual task for the Bakers. And it was also not the only job they had. Now, other members of their crew worked wrecks near Hampton Roads. They did so contriving to get captured by the U.S. Navy to effect their escape north. And one by one, several of the younger men of the company did just that very thing. One such was Evan Stoddard, again pictured here on the right. But next slide, please. Evan managed to get captured, was sent north, went back to his hometown of Ledyard, Connecticut, and promptly volunteered with the Union Navy and served as acting master on Kearsarge. So, one of the men who helped raise the Merrimac helped take down the Alabama. But that's a story for another day. Now, Confederate Navy Secretary Stephen Russell Mallory knew that no ordinary vessel would be able to break the Union blockade. Mallory had studied European ironclad technology, all these things, and he urged Jefferson Davis to adopt a class of vessels hitherto unknown to naval service. Time was short, though, so Mallory thought, I can buy them or I can build them. Perhaps I'll do both. But they needed a design if they're going to build it. And in a meeting with Mallory in late June of 1861, ordnance expert Lieutenant John Mercer Brooks presented an idea for an ironclad with submerged ends and a sloped casemate, housing a battery of powerful rifled guns. At the same meeting, naval constructor John Luke Porter presented a plan for a floating steam battery, which also featured a casemate design. Only one problem. The Confederacy had no quick way to produce a suitable engine to power an ironclad of any design, but it did have the engine from the Merrimac. Though it was designed for a different type of vessel and not a floating battery of what Porter and Brooke had suggested, naval engineer William Price Williamson suggested maybe they could use the Merrimac herself and be converted into an ironclad. Next slide, please. Is it moving? Try hitting it one more time. Ah, there she is. Returning to Portsmouth, John Luke Porter set about adapting Brooks' design to the Merrimac, and Williamson surveyed the engines. This lovely little image here is in John Luke Porter's own hand. It's in his diary held at East Carolina University. By July of 1861, the ironclad project was officially underway. Mallory issued orders to French Forest to build, equip, and fit the Merrimac in all respects according to the designs and plans. The proposed launch date for the converted vessel was November 1861. Now, first they had to remove all the burned portions and assess the overall condition, but they found the hull sound. And so workmen began work, cutting the things down. The Bakers were, again, brought into service to assist with this. And Williamson was overhauling the engine, and he did make it serviceable. They also had to determine how thick the iron on her casemate needed to be. And so John Mercer Brooke ordered tests, since he was relatively sure that the 1-inch thick plates that Tredegar Ironworks in Richmond was capable of rolling at that time weren't going to be the ticket. So he actually conducted tests at Jamestown Island in early October 1861, and determined that he was going to need, he used shot from an 8-inch gun, and it shattered the 1-inch plate. So he realized that he was going to need 2-inch thick, two 2-inch thick layers of iron backed by nearly 2 feet of wood, and that would make the vessel nearly impregnable. Tredegar had to overhaul their rolling machines, and they were able to produce the 2-inch thick pieces of iron. But there were so many delays because Tredegar was in Richmond, and there was, a Union Army in between. So transportation had to be very circuitous. So the material went from Richmond down to North Carolina and then back up to Gosport, which delayed things. And then the Confederate Army didn't make things any easier because sometimes they would commandeer the rail cars, dump the iron over the side, and then put their troops on board. Next slide, please. But slowly the Virginia took shape there in dry dock number 1 at Gosport Navy Yard. I love this little postcard. It's a variation of this one is in the collection of the Chrysler Museum, if memory serves. She was to be a modern vessel, but you can see here she had a very ancient secret weapon below the waterline, a ram or a prow. Though long obsolete as a naval weapon, when steam propulsion replaced wind power, naval engineers thought they'd give it another go. Mallory knew that ramming could be devastating, and especially against the wooden walls of the Union fleet now blockading Hampton Roads. Given the gunpowder shortage in the South, this was really an inspired move because the 1,500-pound ram could easily punch through the sides of those ships. Next slide, please. Now, her engines may have been weak, but her guns were not. In fact, the Confederates kept some of the Merrimac's original 9-inch Dahlgren guns as part of Virginia's battery, but supplemented it with other Dahlgrens that had been cast at Tredegar and were on hand at Gosport. So they were already powerful, but Brooke made them even more devastating by modifying 2 of them to fire hot shots. There was a special furnace installed inside the engine room to heat solid shot to cherry red, around 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit, and this would be a very devastating tool against the wooden walls of the Union fleet. 4 more guns rounded out the battery. The bow and the stern were a 7-inch Brooke rifle, which we believe was actually a banded and sleeved 9-inch Dahlgren. And these were on pivot mounts. And in the broadsides, there were 2 6.4-inch Brooke rifles that were modified 32-pounders. So you can kind of see how the battery here shakes out. Next slide, please. Here's another view. The Merrimac continued to evolve. The sloped casemate would become a feature that would define several Confederate ironclads. And we already talked about the thickness of the iron and the wood. The still unfinished Confederate ironclad, though, was christened, launched, and commissioned as the CSS Virginia on February 17, 1862. Now, intelligence received by Gideon Wells of the U.S. Navy led them to pursue their own ironclads. Next slide, please. What do you do when you need an ironclad? You put an ad in the newspaper. These ads were in newspapers all the way from Boston down to Baltimore, Maryland, advertising for ironclad steam vessels. So basically, the Confederacy knew exactly what the U.S. Navy was up to. As a result of this ad, 16 designs came in, with a final one by John Erickson coming in over the transom. 3 designs were chosen. Some were obviously not going to be chosen because people didn't read what was in the ad and what was required. One fellow even created a design with a rubber clad so the balls would bounce off the sides, presumably. Another one just sent in an idea with no pictures, no plans, and it cost $1.5 million, so that one was discarded. But 3 were chosen, including Erickson's Monitor, or what would become Monitor. She was built in a little over 100 days. Next slide, please. And quickly launched January 30th, 1862, and rushed into service because every day they believed that the Merrimac would come out and wreak havoc in Hampton Roads. And so as soon as it was practical, Monitor was to head to Hampton Roads to sink the converted Merrimac at her moorings. Next slide, please. Well, while imperfect, the erstwhile Merrimac would prove a deadly concern when she finally reached Hampton Roads on her maiden voyage, which was planned for the 6th of March, 1862. But a storm kept the Virginia at her berth. This same storm nearly sank Monitor, rushing her way down the East Coast to Hampton Roads. And so it wasn't until March 8th that Virginia could make her maiden voyage. Now, with workmen still aboard, the commanding officer, Flag Officer Franklin Buchanan, ordered the crew to ready the ship for a cruise. And most of the crew believed this would be a shakedown cruise or test cruise, but Buchanan had let his officers know he intended to take the ironclad directly into battle. So as the crew cast off the mooring lines, the workmen who had been installing or trying to install the gunport gun port shutters fore and aft had to leap from the moving ironclad to the dock, and the Virginia was underway. Now, those observing her departure kept eerily silent, recalling some of the crew years later. And as the Virginia neared Craney Island, Commander Buchanan reportedly said, "Sailors, in a few minutes, you will have the long looked-for opportunity of showing your devotion to our cause." Sorry, my cat is singing along with me here. "Remember that you are about to strike for your company and your homes." And in a nod to Horatio Nelson, he said, "The Confederacy expects every man to do his duty. Feet to quarters." Then he reminded them, "The whole world is watching you today." And in fact, that was true in a kind of meta way. Now, as the Virginia steamed down the Elizabeth River, both banks were crowded with people, and many were just curious to see what this thing, could it float? Some believed in her, or refused to believe that she could, and said, "Go on with your old metal coffin." Some laughed. But the Virginia steamed into Hampton Roads. Next slide, please. Now, Saturday, March 8, 1862, was Laundry Day for the crews of the Union's North Atlantic Blockading Squadron in Hampton Roads. The rigging of the wooden vessels was festooned with blue and white sailors' clothing drying in the late winter sun. Shortly after noon, the quartermaster of Congress, which was anchored off Newport News Point, saw something strange through his telescope. And he turned to the ship's surgeon and said, "I wish you'd take the glass and have a look over there, sir. I believe that thing is a-coming down at last." And that thing was CSS Virginia. The men of the North Atlantic Blockading Squadron, who'd grown weary of waiting for the Virginia to come out, now scrambled to prepare for battle. And in the panic of the moment, and with the tide at ebb, several vessels in Hampton Roads ran aground, including the Congress and Minnesota. But the Cumberland was Buchanan's first target. She had rifled guns that he thought could pose a threat to his ironclad. With his guns firing at the wooden ship, Buchanan rammed the Cumberland on her starboard side. The hole beneath her waterline was large enough to drive a horse and carriage through, as some said, and the ship immediately began to sink, nearly taking the Virginia down with her. You see, Virginia's ram, that ancient weapon, was trapped inside. Now, according to an officer from the Virginia, according to one eyewitness, an officer from the Virginia asked Lieutenant George Upham Morris of the Cumberland to surrender, but Morris apparently retorted, "Damn you, you coward, you've made a slaughterhouse of my ship. We will sink with our colors first." "Sink it is," replied the rebel sailor. And scores of Union sailors from the Cumberland died at their guns or went down with their ship, guns still firing and flags still defiantly flying. Evidence of Cumberland's wreckage would remain in Hampton Roads for months, and soldiers gathered souvenirs from among the items that washed upon the shore. But the Virginia broke free and steamed slowly into the James River. Now, think about this moment here. You've got stranded Union ships. They see the Virginia going up the James River, and they begin to cheer, especially the men on the stranded Congress, thinking they'd been spared the same fate. But the cheer, after the course of about a half an hour, was cut short when they saw all Virginia was doing was turning around. Her withering firepower then tore into Congress for nearly 2 hours, with most of the crew on Congress dead or wounded, including the commanding officer. The next in command was Lieutenant Commander Austin Pendergrass. He surrenders the Congress. But Union batteries on the shore did not know this, or they decided to ignore it and continued to fire on the Confederates who were trying to take surrender from Pendergrass. They were firing on a white flag. Buchanan, seeing this from the Virginia, runs up onto the hurricane deck, exposing himself to this fire. He has a rifle, and he is shooting at the shore and yelling. You can imagine what happens. He quickly becomes a target on the exposed top deck. Wounded pretty gravely, he turns command over to the executive officer, Lieutenant Kate Spiap Roger Jones, who returned the Virginia to her moorings that evening. Falling darkness and a receding tide had saved the steam frigate Minnesota from the same fate as Congress and Cumberland. But there was another day coming. By the lurid light of the burning Congress, Monitor arrived in Hampton Roads on the evening of March 8th and eventually stationed herself by the stranded Minnesota. They could hear the Virginia's crew celebrating across the water. They're celebrating their victory, and all watched in horror as fires reached Congress's powder magazine after midnight, sending pieces of the wounded vessel flying through the air, raining down around them. Just after dawn on March 9th, the men of the Virginia tucked into a hearty breakfast, which included 2 jiggers of whiskey for each man. In contrast, the Monitor's exhausted crew sat together on the berth deck, eating hardtack and canned roast beef, washing it down with coffee. They hadn't slept for days. Next slide, please. Now, folks had seen what had happened the day before and were rushing to the shorelines to watch the Virginia finish the fight. As the fog lifted, the dark bulk of Virginia appeared to be moving towards the Minnesota. Lieutenant John Lorimer Worden of Monitor inquired of the captain of the Minnesota what his intentions were. Captain Van Brunt replied, if I cannot lighten my ship, I shall destroy her. Worden assured Van Brunt that the Monitor would stand up to your last if I can help you, but Van Brunt curtly replied, no, sir, you cannot help me. The exchange between the crew of the Minnesota and the crew of Monitor was apparently a little less civilized. In fact, Paymaster William Keeler wrote that we slowly steamed out of the shadow of our towering friend, no ways daunted by her rather ungracious replies. Now, as I said, fog delayed the Virginia's assault on the stranded Minnesota, so it wasn't until 8 a.m. that the men on the Virginia could make out the hulk of the Minnesota. But they also saw what they thought was a shingle floating in the water with a giant cheese box rising from its center, sitting alongside the frigate. What could it be? Well, the Virginia fired the first shot, a warning of sorts, through the Minnesota's rigging shortly before 8:30. The Minnesota returned fire, as did the cheese box. Confederates who had been following the northern newspapers knew then that the cheese box was none other than the anticipated Erickson's Battery, also known as Monitor. Lieutenant Worden took his place in the pilot house of Monitor along with the pilot and quartermaster who steered the vessel throughout the battle. And in the turret, Executive Officer Samuel Dana Green assembled his gun crew, 8 men per gun, 2 guns. They had nagging questions about the vessel's capabilities because they hadn't fully trained at the guns. The turret mechanism was rusty from the storm they had gone through. The speaking tube between the pilot house and the turret had stopped working already. And to make matters worse, they could only get 1 gun port open at a time. They'd fixed that a few weeks later, but during the battle, there was no time to fix it. To the astonishment of Captain Van Brunt and all the men on the Minnesota, Monitor moved directly towards the Virginia, placing herself between the ironclad and her prey. Now, by putting his vessel in this position, Worden was risking being hit by both combatants as they were firing ricochet shots. The men in the turret waited in suspense you had broadside screaming over them, and when the first broadside hit, it made a dent. Now, it could have been friendly fire from the Minnesota, but they kind of grinned because all it was a dent. Monitor was being tested finally under enemy fire, just as the contract for her had specified. And the officers and crew were forced to improvise given the broken speaking tube, all of these things going wrong. They found they couldn't precisely start and stop the turret. So what they ended up doing was firing on the fly. Now, all of your stationary positions meant nothing. Port and starboard meant nothing. And so they would just have the turret turn at 2 1/4 revolutions per minute. And then they would just fire when the enemy hove in sight. So what the people on the shore and what people from the other vessels saw was a machine with its little head twirling and its eyes blinking as those 2 gun ports and the 2 guns moved seemingly independently. Now, this was frustrating to the Virginia's men because it's an entirely new thing. They were firing in broadside. Here you have this whirling turret. So they began targeting the gun ports of the Monitor's turret. And dents seen in photographs and in the turret itself do show a massing of dents by those gun ports. Now, after a point in the battle, so many of the men on the Virginia were frustrated and gunpowder was precious that they stopped firing. When asked why are you not firing? One crew member said with frustration, why, our powder is precious, sir. And after 2 hours incessant firing, I find I can do her just as much damage by snapping my thumb at her every 2.5 minutes. Now, after about 2 hours of battle, it became necessary to replenish the ammunition in the turret. Now, to do this, you had to align the turret hatches with the deck hatches. So Worden takes the monitor off into the flats to accomplish this. Catesby Jones on board Virginia sees this opportunity and heads straight for the Minnesota, not heeding any information his pilot was giving him. Virginia runs aground. This becomes very, very frightening because unbeknownst to the crew on the Monitor or even the Minnesota, Virginia had a vulnerable wooden hull, and her load was lightening as she was expending more shot and gunpowder. So Jones knew he had to take all the chances he could to get back out of the mud flat. Otherwise, they would be a sitting duck and they would be torn apart below the waterline. So they lashed down the safety valves on the engine, heaped quick-burning combustibles into the raging fires, and then brought the boilers to a pressure that probably was unsafe under any other condition. Piling on anything that would burn, the massive ship finally pulled free, her boilers intact. So after finding he's safe, assessing the situation, Jones decides he's going to use his ram, not realizing that the ram had broken off in Cumberland the day before. So he's going to ram Monitor. So he gets into position, which takes a half an hour, and gets up to ramming speed, which 4 knots. Try it sometime, and comes at the Monitor. But Monitor, being more nimble, was able to get out of the way quickly and circle back around for her own ramming maneuver. Worden targets the fantail of Virginia, and he's heading towards it, but he realizes he may be boarded. And in fact, Catesby Jones was considering boarding Monitor, and instead of using guns, they would use peacoats and grenades. The peacoat would blind the pilot house. Grenades could wreak havoc, being thrown down inside the ironclad, and they could also poison everyone with the gases from the engine. Worden realizes this and quickly makes another maneuver and heads back towards the fantail where there were no men stationed. And as he does so, one of the rifled stern guns fires directly into the Monitor's pilot house at a range of 10 yards. And the blast tears open the structure, cracking one of the huge iron logs and lifting the top off. Worden, though protected a little bit, took the full force of the explosion to his face. Stunned, temporarily blinded, he says, "Gentlemen, I leave it to you. Do what you think is best. I cannot see, but do not mind me. Save the Minnesota if you can." And so he takes command, turns it over to Lieutenant Green, and Green determines that there's so much space between him and Virginia, and the Virginia appears to be heading back to Sewell's Point in defeat. And so Green does not pursue Virginia. In turn, on board the Virginia, they see Monitor scurrying off towards Fort Monroe. And so both sides claim victory. Now, neither would truly meet one another in battle again. They would spend most of the rest of their time glaring at each other across Hampton Roads, Monitor being ordered not to engage with the Virginia again unless it was absolutely necessary. Let's turn to May of 1862. Following the Battle of Hampton Roads, President Lincoln becomes anxious for General McClellan to do something, really anything. But McClellan, the original Virginia Creeper, had still not executed his Peninsular Plan by the beginning of May. So Lincoln traveled personally to Hampton Roads on May 6th to force McClellan's hand and break the stalemate between the Army and the Navy that was hampering all this action. Lincoln visited Monitor on the 7th of May, but cries of "There's the Merrimac" cut short his visit. But he was able to see some of the technological marvels on what was called Lincoln's secret weapon. Now, on the morning of May 10th, Union forces landed on the shore of Ocean View in Norfolk, and began moving inland. By 5 p.m., they had reached downtown Norfolk, and the principal objective for the Confederates in advance of this was to destroy the Navy Yard. So in an eerie replay of the events of April 20th, 1861, flames once again engulfed Gosport, but this time set by Confederate hands. And in the frantic rush, no one informed Commander Josiah Tatnall, now in command of CSS Virginia, that Norfolk had fallen earlier than anticipated. So the Virginia was now without a home. He didn't want to risk being captured. To try to make a run out to sea would put the Virginia going between the guns of the Ripraps in Fort Monroe, and that would likely tear her to pieces. Some people wanted to abandon her, and when the Union forces took her, they would probably have a big party, and they could attack then when everyone was drunk. That was not a really good plan, though. The only viable option was to take her up the James River, but she had to lighten her load to get over the James River bar. Unfortunately, they lightened the load as much as they could, but the wind shifted around midnight, and the pilots on board Virginia said there was no way they could make it over the bar. So only one thing was left. Next slide, please. Oh, that's Lincoln there at Fortress Monroe. Sorry, I missed that one. Next slide. This is the course of action that Tatnall took. Just as the Virginia had been destroyed to keep her from enemy hands a little over a year before, now she faced destruction from her own men once again. At 2 a.m. on May 11th, the call was given for Virginia's crew to splice the main brace by drinking a double ration of grog, and then Tatnall ordered the vessel run aground at Craney Island and the men told to evacuate. A small detachment rigged the vessel to explode and set her ablaze. The time was 4:58 a.m. Richard Curtis, who had manned one of the guns, recalled, "Thus the finest fighting ship that had ever floated on American waters at that time came to an untimely end at the hands of her friends with no enemy within." On the way up the Elizabeth River the following morning, the Monitor crew got their first glimpse of what was left of Virginia. Several of them collected souvenirs to send home. Next slide. Now, by early June 1862, it was clear the ruins of the Virginia were a menace to navigation, and so Major General John Wool of the U.S. Army took it upon himself to advertise for a firm to remove the wreck from the channel. Flag Officer Goldsborough of the U.S. Navy begged to differ, and a testy exchange developed between them, with Wool saying, "Well, she's no longer a Navy asset, so I have control of the salvage." He says the vessel does not belong to the Navy, she being entirely remodeled and ironclad at the time of her destruction. Well, Goldsborough says, "I reply in your communications today, I have to say that from the instructions I received, I cannot permit anyone to raise the Merrimac under any contract made by you. The wreck is placed distinctly under my charge by the Navy Department, and as to your statement about her not belonging to the Navy, I differ with you entirely in opinion. Respectfully, your obedient servant." Nevertheless, the work had to be done. So the Senate had actually appropriated $100,000 for raising the vessels in Hampton Roads and put out an RFP, essentially. And it was answered by dozens of firms, although not the Bakers. Why? Well, they were working for the Army. But a Captain Thomas Wells of Boston actually had the winning bid. He was going to raise the Cumberland hull, raise what was left of the Merrimac and the Congress, deliver any bodies free of charge, any personal property free of charge. In fact, he said he would raise all sunken vessels from Fortress Monroe to Norfolk. That's a pretty big charge there. He brought hundreds of men, 300, 20 divers, and 4 salvage vessels. And they had some success, having cleared some parts of the wrecks from the Navy Yard. But despite his divers giving a really rosy analysis of the Cumberland and the Merrimac hulls, those vessels stayed put. Wells extended close to $70,000 on the attempt, and the Navy had very little to show for it. In fact, attempts carried on in the later years of the war and the need to remove the wreck only took on increased urgency, particularly when it embarrassed certain members of the armed forces. In January of 1864, one Major General Butler left Hampton Roads for Washington, but his steamer, the City of Hudson, was sunk by none other than the Merrimac. Now, everyone survived. They were taken off by another steamer, but it was a big embarrassment, and clearly a very dangerous situation. By February of 1864, the Navy was soliciting for new proposals. This time they added the phrase, "No wreck will be considered removed while any portion of the keel or floor timbers remain." And finally, there came a wrecker with incredible determination, local diver David Underdown. Underdown worked tirelessly. He began using dynamite, and so periodically the newspapers would crow, "Merrimac is being blown up again." I think next slide, I believe. Yes, and so Underdown takes over in 1864, and by August of 1865, he actually was able to work on the Congress, pump out the field hull, and raise what was left of that ship using steam-powered derricks to lift her. And he towed her first to Ferry Flats off Barkley before bringing her to the Navy Yard. In December of 1865, Underdown raised a large portion of Merrimac. He did this in effect by building a cofferdam around the wreck and using steam pumps to force the water out. But the hull proved too large and too unwieldy, and so he could only bring up portions of it using dynamite, steam pumps, and divers. But the wreck was still a menace. The Merrimac sinks her next victim in December of 1866, the steamer Adelaide. And Adelaide was a part of the Boston Steam Packet Company's Old Bay line. And anyway, again, no one was harmed. Her passengers were all rescued by none other than the Baker Wrecking Company. So you can see you've got all these different wrecking concerns and people working on these vessels. Next slide, please. Here you can just see one of the diving suit of the period, and it's really hard to make this out, but this is some of the material that was brought up from the wreck of the Virginia. Next slide, please. All right, in 1874, oh, I'm sorry, we need to finish up with Underdown. He brings up the boilers and what he says is the prow of the Virginia in May of 1867, the anchor in 1868, but sadly, Underdown dies of a stroke in December of that year, having lost more money than he ever made on the contract. But after a point for him, it had become a matter of pride. John Hebrew takes over the contract in 1861, but doesn't have a lot of success. And finally, in 1874, the Bakers step back in, both in their own capacity as a company and as a rental agency of wrecking vessels for other fellow wreckers and divers to work. You see, they could afford all these RFPs for raising the Merrimac. They now had a business that stretched far beyond the waters of Hampton Roads. But here you see, they are taking their bites, made at this cherry, and the article goes on, "We imagine that a clean sweep will be made at this time as this firm is not in the habit of doing things by halves." Well, not so fast. The Bakers did not finish the job. In fact, they essentially subcontracted to some of their other associates, and they bring up pieces of it, but they also subcontract to William West. I think that's the next slide here, 1875. Yeah, still blowing up the Merrimac, William West. He continues to dig and blast away at the remains of the Confederate war monster Merrimac. And I love this. For 12 years now, they've been exploding powder around her remains, and the end is not yet. Now, the last major salvage effort was in 1876. Next slide, please. And here you can see the remains of the celebrated Confederate ironclad Merrimac were towed up to the Navy Yard yesterday by the tugboats Nettie, Baker, Edwin Ludlow, not Baker, 4 large pontoons being attached to the hull. They belong to the Bakers. And you can see it was taken to the Navy Yard. People were actually invited to take souvenirs from her at this time. And so this was the last major effort. Now, bits and bobs were dredged up at different times, but very little material is now left. Today, you can no longer try to salvage the Virginia because Craney Island is now a wildlife refuge and an industrial area, which has been used as a location for placement of dredged material since 1957 and is operated by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. What little material is left is probably covered in sill. The rumored boilers of the Merrimac, which had been reported in the early 2000s, are the wrong shape, And we saw that Underdown likely brought up the boilers, though what has been seen could be some of the pontoons used by the Bakers in their 1874 attempt. They did lose one or two. But the Virginia lives on in museums. Next slide, please. Ah, I forgot I had this one. This is a lovely piece from the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard Museum showing the Merrimac being brought into the dock of May 30th, 1876 to be cut up. Next slide, please. Yes, the Virginia lives on in museums around the region. Her wheel and her napkin rings even can be seen at the Mariners Museum in Newport News. Her bell at the Hampton Roads Naval Museum in Norfolk. Anchor and shaft at the Museum of the Confederacy in Richmond. And other souvenirs and parts are spread out across the nation, from tiny relics taken by the Monitor boys in 1862 to the tourist scavengers at the yard in the 1870s, or the souvenirs from her iron made during the 1907 Jamestown Expo. She was a technological wonder herself, and all methods of 19th century salvage and diving technology were used to remove her from her watery grave. I want to thank you, and I look forward to any questions that you might have.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Holloway, for that wonderful presentation. You know, it's really interesting because you hear so much about Monitor fever, right, after the Monitor's successful test. But the Confederacy really had their own fever because, you know, they had a choice. They were going to use commerce raiders and blockade runners, but they had a choice to build a fleet of gunboats or relatively few ironclads. And after the Battle of Hampton Roads, they clearly chose to build ironclads. So they really both went ironclad crazy, I guess, to an extent.
They did.
We have a few questions, so let's get to it. If I can just open up the panel here. So one participant asks, after the Battle of Hampton Roads, what was the reaction of European nations, and how did the use of ironclad vessels change their tactics and training?
Well, it took a while for the news to actually reach Europe, although there were European observers at Hampton Roads. But the news itself takes till about March 22nd before you start getting the first reports. Mm-hmm. And some were adamant that we must, you know, scrap all of our wooden ships because they're obsolete. We must turn to ironclads. Of course, the nations of France and Great Britain had already begun working with ironclad technology, and so it does cause a shift in where monies are going to be put. But it is not the immediate thing that you see in Hollywood. It is a very deliberate move towards ironclad technology, towards the steam power, you know, the power of steam over sail, and then of course the ordnance technology as well. It's all kind of a package that comes together.
Thank you. Another participant asks, was Lincoln involved in the Battle of Hampton Roads in any way?
No, he was not there. He was keenly interested in the news that was coming out of Hampton Roads on March 8th. But the cable lines that were sending news north were broken and not repaired until later on the 9th. So there was this period of not really knowing what was going on. But no, he was not physically there, although mentally, obviously, he was. But he does visit Monitor twice. On May 7th, as I mentioned before, and then later in July on the James River, he comes really to relieve Goldsborough of his command and visits the Monitor. And that is an interesting day because that's the day photographs were taken on board Monitor. Mm-hmm. But Lincoln got there too early and the photographer got there too late. So there are no photos of him. Although the late wonderful artist Tom Freeman did recreate a scene in one of his paintings of Lincoln meeting the men on the Monitor and recreating those Gibson photos.
We have several participants interested in the following question. What is your opinion on the information that Civil War spy Mary Lou Vest passed along to the Navy Department? Did her information make a difference in the Navy's plans to combat the CSS Virginia?
Right. I believe that Mary's work, along with that of other spies and informants, really did give a sense of urgency to Gideon Wells. And of course, Wells writes about her later about how she did come to him with a sketch of these plans, and it just kind of hit home that yes, this thing is a growing concern in Hampton Roads. So I do believe that her work and that of others did make a difference. It did give them the sense of urgency to move forward quickly.
Great. One participant asks, has the Virginia's ram ever been found?
Good question. Many of you know or recall that Clive Cussler actually went looking for it with Numa back, I want to say in the 80s maybe, but nothing really conclusive was found. But my friends at Hampton Roads Naval probably know more about Cumberland than I do. But the interesting thing is the ram that Underdown brought up. I mean, apparently he did put it on display. He was able to put an ad in the paper for it to be put on sale, and wanted it to go to a museum. Now, granted, this is a newspaper ad. We can't really put, the full force of history on that. But he may have recovered part of the second ram from the Virginia. It's possible. We just don't know because all we have is this ad to go on, and where it went, we don't know. There was one newspaper article that mentions that it was sent to New York City. Well, where is it?
And is this the ad that was run in 1867? Because that relates to, a following question, which you just answered. Did the development of ironclad ships lead to a scarcity of metal for other uses during the war?
In the South, it certainly did. And there were, Tredegar was running through a lot of the available iron, and we know there's reports that rarely used railways were being scavenged for parts. I don't know what happened to the iron that the Confederate Army threw off the train, but yeah, there certainly was, especially for the South, there were issues with supply. But there were also issues with, where there was material to be used, it was how do you transport it? So that became a growing concern, just not being able to get the materials to where they needed to be.
One attendee comments that one of the guns of Virginia is on display in Fredericksburg. Certainly one is at the Monitor Center.
I believe the Fredericksburg gun is actually the one currently at the Monitor Center.
Okay.
And that is one that the muzzle was broken off during day one. They did not have time to replace it, so when they tried to fire it later, it was spewing flames. But it was taken off of Virginia when she was undergoing repairs after the Battle of Hampton Roads. And so it was left at Gosport when the Confederates burned the yard in May of 1862. So it was taken by the U.S. Navy as trophy number 1. And thanks to the wonderful work that the conservators at Mariners Museum did, they were able to really make that engraving. It says trophy number 1 and everything, just really easy to view. And I believe the gun is still on display there, and it is an amazing piece to see.
Certainly. Another attendee says, I recently visited the USS Cairo in Vicksburg, Mississippi, since it's the best preserved ironclad. I was wondering, what are the main similarities and differences between the two ship designs, I assume between the Virginia and the Cairo?
Right. Part of it is the motive power. I'm trying to wrap my mind back around Cairo. It's been a while since I've seen her. But, you do have that sloped casemate design. And it was something that could be adaptable for both sides. It was a wonderful design. The sloped side, generally 36 degrees, gave the right amount of bounce off the sides. Now, I want to say Cairo's engines were placed midships.
I think so.
But yeah, the one big difference, and this is a fun story, you know, a lot of your later Confederate ironclads and then ironclads that were along the lines of Cairo, they are more blunt. They don't have those rounded parts like the Virginia has. And when we were building Monitor Center, many of you, if you've been there, you know that we built up a huge portion of the forward casemate of Virginia. And all we had to go on were John Luke Porter's plans. And so when we're trying to build this thing, we realized why they switched to the more blunt sides. It's because it's a lot easier and a lot cheaper to build. But if you do get a chance to go to Cairo, the museum there has so much incredible material culture on display because all of the men's personal possessions, they kind of went down with the ship, and they've been you know, well preserved, and it's fun to look at them and compare them with similar artifacts that are on display in Monitor Center. I mean, we've got some of the same standard issue mustard and pepper bottles and things of that nature. So there was a common experience that these men had.
And we have one final question. I think it's a very fitting one to end the presentation with. What happened to the Virginia's crew after it was scuttled?
Well, here's the interesting thing. Several of the Virginia's crew were actually Army, not Navy. And so they went right back into, you know, working within the Army, and some of them were sent up the James River for the defenses of Richmond and ended up at Drury's Bluff. And on May 15th of 1862, here comes the ironclad fleet of Monitor, Naugatuck, Galena, several other vessels. And up there on the bluff are some of the Virginia's former crew. Now, there's a story that is probably apocryphal, but there's a story that once the Union fleet was unable to make an effective return of fire to the guns on the bluff above, and the Galena was being torn apart, they turned around. Plunging fire was not going to be good for any of them, least of which Monitor. And the story goes that one of the Virginia's former officers yelled down to Monitor, Richmond is the other direction. You want it to be true, but who knows?
Right.
And then one of the bosun on board Virginia was an interesting fellow, Charles Hazelwood Hasker. He ends up on another experimental vessel. That would be the Hunley.
Right.
He survives.
Right. Well, thank you so much, not only to you, Dr. Holloway, but to all of our participants tonight. Thank you for joining us. This has been a fantastic lecture. We appreciate everyone's involvement. Of course, you, Dr. Holloway, as well. I hope everyone has a wonderful evening, and good night.
Good night. Hey, Marcus.